Hi everyone, welcome to the channel. In today's video, we're going to be continuing with our beginner level character course on how to create this little monster game character in Blender and then export it into the Unity game engine. In this fourth installment, we will UV unwrap our model so that it's optimized for texture painting and baking. We will start by sculpting in some details and a pattern on the skin, then add a UV grid map, mark seams, unwrap, and adjust the UV islands to maximize our UV space. This course is a 9-part series on a game character workflow. We will be picking up right from the end of part 3 here. Link to the playlist should be above or below if you want to jump around. Anyways, let's get started. Okay, to start off, let's quickly sculpt in some subtle details and a pattern on the skin. When I control tab into sculpt mode, however, you'll notice that our shrink wrap modifier sort of disappears and we lose the detail of our sculpt. To fix this, tab into object mode and apply the shrink wrap modifier. Now we have locked in the details of the shrink wrap into the multi-resolution modifier. Now when we control tab into sculpt mode, we can take the crease brush for instance and start sharpening up some of the lines on the body like this. Here I'm just going to go around, kind of accentuate some of the creases around the arms and the horns, the mouth and the eyes. For the skin pattern, I'm going to press M for the sculpt mask brush and draw in a fun pattern like this. Something that you might see on a cartoon dinosaur or on an Amazonian frog. Once you're happy with the pattern, let's go to the mask filter and then select Inflate up here. Now press Ctrl I to invert the sculpt mask, and then left click and pull to the right in the viewport. And you should see our pattern sort of raise up a bit off the skin, which gives a nice little detail. Alt M to clear the sculpt mask, and now you can see we have a fun pattern with some texture to it as well. Okay, now onto the UV unwrapping. Let's first add a UV grid texture to our model. This UV grid texture will allow us to see how our textures will appear on our model. Our main goal here is to have the UV grid squares as uniform and square as possible. Any stretching or skewing we see here will translate to how our textures look later. Okay, so now I'm going to go to the shading tab. Make sure you are in the object mode here. And then select your model. I added in some colors to the model earlier just to get an idea of how he might look. So if you did the same, you'll want to click here on the minus button to remove them from the model. With all of our materials removed, let's now click on the body of our model again, and then click here on the New button to add a new material. I'm going to name this Little Monster. This will be our new texture map, where we'll be adding in all the colors for the entire model. Now in the Node window, I'm going to press Shift A and then select Search. Then I'm going to type Image in the search bar to add in an image texture node. Connect the color node up to the base color of the principled BSDF like this. And then here, let's click on the New button again. And I'm going to name this UV grid. I'm going to increase the width and height to 2048 by 2048. You generally want to keep your maps a power of 2, something like 512 by 512, 1024 by 1024, and so on. I'm going to untick alpha as this relates to transparency, which we don't need. And then here in the generated type menu, I'm going to select UV grid, then press OK. Now let's shift select the other parts of the model, the tongue, teeth, eyes, and horns. Now over here, click on this drop-down menu and then select the little monster material we just created. Then press Ctrl L and then select Materials from the list to add the material to all the other selected objects quickly. Okay, now back over to the UV editing tab. Let's start unwrapping our model. To unwrap, select the body, then tab into edit mode. I'm going to now Alt left mouse button on the center edge loop we created in our retopology stage. And then press Ctrl E and select Mark Seam. The loop should now be red. Press A to select all the vertices. Then press U and select Unwrap. Now you can see our UV grid texture showing up on the model. And over on the left, you'll see our model has now been flattened out like a piece of paper, the front and the back, along the seam line we just marked. The goal here is to get the squares as uniform and square as possible. Now I'm going to Alt left click the middle vertical edge loop. And then press B and middle mouse button to box deselect the vertices on the face. Now press E and select Mark Seam again. Press A to select all, and then U and select Unwrap. You can tick the Live Unwrap box here, so that each time you add or delete a seam, it will automatically re-unwrap your model for you. Now you can see over on the left, the flattened out version of our model has changed a bit to reflect the new seam we just created. Very generally, you want to create seams where you might see seams on clothing appear. Here I'm going to select the loop around the shoulder, Ctrl E and mark seam. To have it mirror over to the other side, you can press F3 and then type Symmetrize, and it will flip all your seams over to the other side. This seemed to have erased the shoulder seam I just created though, and that's because down here in this menu, the orientation of my Symmetrize function is set to -X to +X, whereas in my case, I want it to be the other way, so I'll select +X to -X. Now you'll see my shoulder seam is on both sides. Symmetrizing also helps in maximizing our UV space as well, as it basically cuts everything in half. Keep in mind this will mean your texturing will be mirrored, so if you want some asymmetry in your textures, I wouldn't use this function. Now I'm going to create a seam around the ankle. I don't like this one, so I'm going to select it again, Ctrl E, and then select Clear Seam to remove it. Generally, on cylindrical objects like arms and feet, creating a seam down the length of the shape will really nicely clean up the UVs. So I'm going to create one down the middle like this. And you can see that that cleans it up nicely. Now onto the tongue, teeth, eyes, and horns. Here I'm just going to create seams right down the middle of most of the objects to keep things simple. If you want to keep the UVs a little cleaner, I would suggest leaving a small one-face gap in your seam going around. That way when it unwraps, it stays as one UV island, instead of splitting into two separate ones like I have here. It won't have a huge effect as we're just going to paint on the model directly, but I think it makes organizing your UV maps a little nicer. For the eyes, I'm going to create a seam around where I want the iris to be. Okay, so with everything unwrapped, I'm going to select all the objects of my character. You can see on the left the UV space isn't very well utilized, as there are large gaps of space not being used. To fix this, go up to the UV menu and select Pack Islands. Now everything is nicely packed onto the UV map. In order to make the baking of our ambient occlusion maps a little cleaner, I would suggest increasing the margin size here. This will create space in between the UV islands, which we'll need when baking our ambient occlusion to avoid overlapping shadows. I'm going to go with 0.03 as it gives a nice amount of space. If you wanted to do some further manual adjustment of the UV islands, I would suggest clicking up here on the UV sync selection box, and then changing to face select mode. Now when you select faces in one of the windows, the corresponding faces will be highlighted in the other window as well, which is a handy way to understand where you're editing as you go. Pressing L on your keyboard will allow you to select all the linked vertices of a given UV island quickly. Here I want to increase the resolution of the eyes a bit, so I'm going to press L over the iris of the eye. Then G to move them off the UV map for now. I'm going to move them a little bit closer to each other, select them both, and then scale them up a bit. As I do, you'll notice the squares get smaller on the eyes in the right viewport, meaning we will have more detail on this part of the model, which is what I want for when I go to paint in the eyes. Now let's move them back into the UV space and position them into an open area. Now you can organize some of your UV islands better if you wanted, or scale them up or down depending on where you want more detail. Here I'm adjusting the scale of the tongue a bit. Just make sure the UV islands don't overlap, as this can cause issues when we go to paint. And that's it for this video. Hopefully you have a model that looks something like this, with relatively uniform squares that are not stretched. This looks okay for me, so I'm going to pull out my to-do list and call part 4 done. In the next video, in part 5, we will texture paint some colors on the character and bake the normal and ambient occlusion shadow maps. Couple quick shoutouts. Shout out to Joe Blake Art on Instagram, who did a pretty sweet job on the bear tutorial with this honey drizzled piece he's calling the Bear Necessities. Check out his Instagram and website, joeblakeart.co.uk. And to Michael Sevenangelo on Instagram, who did an awesome job on the hunter tutorial. Nice details and textures, and look at those rippling abs. Great job to both of you. Thanks again for the shoutouts. Looking forward to seeing more. Feel free to ask questions below. I try and answer all of them, and sometimes I actually help. Oh yeah. If you want to share your art or ask a question, I have a little group on Facebook going. Link is below. Or you can just hit me up on social media somewhere. I love seeing your guys' stuff. I have Twitter, Instagram, Discord, and Twitch as well. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys. I hope it helped, and see you in the next one.